Michael and Laura's search for forbidden thrills collided with Daniel and Rachel's reckless secrets, and together their wife-swap fantasy spiraled into jealousy, betrayal, and a shocking murder that no one saw coming. Under the glow of porch lights and the quiet hum of suburban life, two couples began a journey that would spiral far beyond their control. Their lives seemed ordinary to anyone looking in from the outside: tidy lawns, weekend barbecues, and polite conversations with neighbors. Beneath that surface, however, was an unspoken dissatisfaction, the kind that grows slowly until it consumes everything around it. Both marriages had slipped into a pattern of routine, with the spark that once bound them fading into silence. The husbands worked long hours, the wives felt ignored, and everyone longed for something to break the monotony. It was during one of those long evenings, when the air hung heavy with boredom, that the idea first surfaced. They stumbled upon online forums filled with stories of couples who dared to step outside the boundaries of tradition. The words on those screens promised excitement, adventure, and a return of passion that seemed impossible inside their fading relationships. They read about people who swapped partners, who flirted with danger but walked away smiling. What started as laughter and disbelief quickly turned into late-night conversations that grew more serious each time. Curiosity whispered louder than reason, and soon what once sounded reckless began to sound like an answer. The plan seemed simple enough. No feelings, no attachments, just one night where boundaries blurred and boredom disappeared. Both couples agreed that honesty would protect them. They told themselves that trust was the foundation of this game and that stepping into something forbidden together would make them stronger. But hidden beneath their reassurances were cracks waiting to split wide open. One of the husbands, though he nodded and smiled, carried a secret storm inside him. He hated the thought of another man touching his wife, but his pride and fear of being left behind kept him from speaking out. Instead, he bottled up his anger, disguising it with a false mask of confidence. His silence would later prove to be more dangerous than any words he could have spoken. The night of the arrangement arrived with an unsettling tension. The couples prepared carefully, each one playing the role they thought was expected of them. Drinks were poured, laughter was forced, and the atmosphere carried the strange weight of anticipation mixed with dread. Every glance seemed longer than usual, every touch more deliberate, every pause charged with an invisible electricity. Beneath the surface of forced smiles, jealousy and insecurity churned like a storm waiting to erupt. For one wife, the evening awakened something she thought had died long ago. She felt desired again, noticed in a way that her own husband had stopped showing her years ago. It was intoxicating, and for the first time in a long time she felt alive. She leaned into the experience with an eagerness that surprised even herself. Across the room, her husband noticed every detail, the way she smiled, the way her eyes lingered, the way she seemed transformed in someone else's presence. Each moment carved into him like a blade, yet he said nothing. His silence was louder than any words could have been, his rage growing under the surface like a fire without oxygen, waiting for a chance to ignite. When the night was over, they pretended everything was fine. The couples parted ways with nervous laughter and half-hearted promises that it was just an experiment, nothing more. Outwardly, the plan had worked. They had crossed the line and returned, seemingly unharmed. But inside, things had shifted. Trust had been broken, boundaries shattered, and emotions awakened that none of them could control. What they had called harmless fun was already leaving scars. Over the next few days, the weight of what had happened lingered. The wives replayed the night in their minds, each with her own secret thoughts. One felt regret but buried it under forced normalcy, while the other basked in the thrill of what she had experienced. The husbands carried their own burdens. One convinced himself that it had been nothing but a mistake they could forget, while the other became consumed by the images that haunted his mind. Every detail of that night became sharper in his memory, and every moment drove him further into obsession. The couples avoided talking about it directly, but the silence between them was louder than words. Subtle changes began to show. A missed dinner here, a late-night text there, excuses that felt thin but were left unchallenged. It was no longer just an arrangement. It was the seed of something darker. What had started as a fantasy designed to breathe life into their marriages had planted distrust and desire where loyalty once lived. The husband who had swallowed his rage the deepest found himself watching his wife differently. He noticed the way she dressed when leaving the house, the sudden care she took with her appearance, the way she smiled at her phone when she thought he wasn't looking. His suspicions grew, and with them came sleepless nights and obsessive thoughts. He began checking her phone, scrolling through her messages, and searching for proof of betrayal. What he didn't realize was that the fantasy night had not ended when the couple said it was over. For his wife, it had opened a door she was not ready to close. By now, the fragile agreement they had made was already breaking apart. The lines between excitement and destruction blurred with each passing day. The neighbors still waved politely, unaware of the storm brewing behind those walls. To the outside world, the couples remained ordinary, blending into the calm of suburban life. But inside, jealousy, lust, and obsession were twisting into something dangerous. The game they had played once for fun had already turned into a nightmare, even if they could not yet see how far it would go. What none of them realized that first night was how quickly control could slip away. What was meant to be temporary had begun to take root, and the choices they made would not fade quietly into the past. The fantasy they thought they could manage had already started to manage them. It was no longer about trust, love, or even curiosity. It was about power, possession, and a hunger that would not stop growing until it consumed everything in its path. The morning after their arrangement, the neighborhood looked exactly the same. The trimmed hedges, parked cars, and mailboxes gave no sign of the storm brewing inside two homes. Yet beneath the surface of this carefully maintained suburbia, everything had shifted. What had been planned as one night of adventure refused to remain contained. Instead, it became the spark for secrets, betrayals, and obsessions that were impossible to undo. One of the wives, who had gone into the experience uncertain, found herself replaying every moment of that night in her head. For years, she had lived with a husband who rarely noticed her, who treated intimacy as a routine obligation rather than an act of passion. But in the arms of someone else, she had felt wanted, cherished, even admired. That small taste of attention lit a fire inside her that she could not smother. The more she tried to bury the feelings, the stronger they grew. She began sneaking glances at her phone, smiling at secret messages, and making excuses for why she needed to stay out later than usual. The man she had connected with during the swap was equally restless. He had told himself it was nothing more than a thrill, but the excitement pulled at him like gravity. He began sending her messages late at night, reminding her of the way she had looked at him, of the chemistry neither of them could deny. It started with harmless words, but soon those conversations became more intimate, turning into plans for private meetings. What had been presented as a single event had quietly transformed into an affair. The husband of this woman noticed the changes almost immediately. She carried herself differently, her mood shifting in ways he could not explain. At first, he thought it was guilt weighing on her, but then he began to notice patterns. She would hide her phone the moment he entered the room. She lingered in the bathroom for far too long. She took sudden care in her appearance before heading out, wearing dresses she had not touched in years. The subtle signs whispered betrayal, but he wanted to believe he was imagining it. Still, a seed of suspicion grew in him, and soon that suspicion hardened into certainty. His jealousy became unbearable. He started checking her text messages when she wasn't looking. He searched her email, tracked her movements, and scrolled through her call logs, desperate for confirmation of what he already knew in his gut. The deeper he dug, the more the evidence piled up. A late-night rendezvous disguised as a trip to the grocery store, a mysterious contact saved under a fake name, a receipt from a restaurant where she claimed never to have been. Each clue was a dagger, carving away at the fragile trust that had once held their marriage together. Meanwhile, the other couple faced their own fractures. The wife who had not continued the affair felt guilty for what had happened, but her husband sensed something was still wrong. He had been too quick to embrace the swap, hoping it would bring a spark back into his marriage, but now he felt the weight of regret pressing down on him. He noticed the coldness in his wife's behavior, the distance in her eyes, the hesitation in her touch. He tried to dismiss it, but soon he too began to suspect that something had carried on long after the night was over. The two men, both simmering with paranoia and resentment, began to unravel in different ways. One carried his anger silently, bottling it up as he tried to gather proof of his wife's betrayal. The other grew volatile, lashing out at his wife in arguments that escalated into shouting matches. Both felt humiliated, both consumed by the idea that their trust had been shattered. The fragile balance between the four of them was collapsing, but none dared to speak openly about the truth. Instead, they allowed the silence to grow heavier with each passing day. The affair deepened in secrecy. The wife, who had found new passion, couldn't resist the thrill of sneaking around. Each encounter gave her a rush, a sense of control and liberation she had never known in her marriage. But with every stolen moment came greater risk. Neighbors began noticing her car parked in unusual places. A friend spotted her at a restaurant with someone who was not her husband. Rumors began to spread quietly, adding another layer of tension to the already fragile situation. Her husband's obsession with uncovering her betrayal took a darker turn. He began following her car at night, waiting outside places she visited and documenting her movements. He became a shadow, watching her every step. His world shrank until it revolved entirely around proving her disloyalty. He convinced himself that once he had undeniable evidence, he would confront her and regain control. But the longer he watched, the more consumed he became by rage. In the other household, arguments grew louder and more violent. The second husband could not escape the feeling that he had been made a fool. He resented the entire arrangement and resented his wife even more for agreeing to it. The fights became daily occurrences, filled with accusations and slammed doors. Their home, once calm and predictable, became a battleground. The wife, though innocent of the ongoing affair, found herself trapped in a cycle of anger she could not escape. The wives, who had once been close friends, now drifted apart. Their secret meetings were laced with tension, each aware of the wedge driven between their marriages. One tried to hide her guilt, while the other carried the burden of constant suspicion. What had once been laughter shared over coffee became guarded conversations, each word weighed carefully. The fantasy, which had promised excitement and liberation, had left nothing but wreckage in its wake. The boundaries they thought they could manage had vanished completely, replaced by lies, suspicion, and secrecy. What none of them realized was how quickly this dangerous game was spiraling out of control. The obsession, the jealousy, and the desperation were building towards something explosive, something far darker than they could have imagined. The men who had once trusted each other as friends now saw enemies in every glance. The women who had once shared their lives openly now carried secrets too heavy to confess. The affair that had started with whispers and stolen moments was pulling them all toward disaster. Each choice they made tightened the web they were caught in, and soon there would be no way out. The neighborhood still slept peacefully each night, unaware of the darkness creeping behind the walls of these two houses. To outsiders, it looked like any other street, with children playing, sprinklers hissing on lawns, and families waving at one another. But within those homes, destruction was unfolding quietly, building toward a night when suspicion would explode into violence. The fantasy that had promised a new beginning was already proving to be the end. The quiet streets of the neighborhood masked the chaos that had taken root in two homes. By now, weeks had passed since the arrangement that was supposed to be a harmless experiment, but the damage it unleashed grew more visible with every day. What began as whispered excitement had twisted into secrets and lies that poisoned every interaction. The couples no longer trusted one another, and every glance, every word, every silence carried a weight that could not be ignored. The wife, who had embraced the thrill of her new attention, found herself pulled further into the arms of her lover. At first, their meetings were rare, stolen moments filled with fear and excitement. But as the days went on, the secrecy became less about fear and more about necessity. She couldn't stay away. She told herself that she deserved this, that after years of neglect, she had a right to feel desired. But deep down, she knew she was playing with fire. Each kiss, each touch, each meeting carved a deeper rift between her and her husband. And though she tried to mask it with normal routines, he saw through her with growing certainty. Her husband's obsession consumed him. What began as suspicion had now hardened into conviction. He followed her late at night, documenting her movements, tracking her phone, and digging into her digital life. Every new piece of evidence fueled his rage. He no longer wondered if she was unfaithful, he knew it. But knowing was not enough. He wanted proof that would crush her lies, and he wanted revenge for the humiliation he felt. He carried his anger like a second skin, moving through each day with the simmering fury of a man betrayed. The other couple's life had also fractured beyond repair. The husband, who had once welcomed the arrangement, now found himself consumed by bitterness. He no longer saw it as a mutual choice, but as a mistake forced upon him, one that had poisoned his marriage. He hurled accusations at his wife, insisting she had continued the game behind his back. No amount of denial eased his paranoia. His voice rose in anger with each confrontation, and objects were smashed against walls during arguments that left the house in shambles. The once calm and steady man was gone, replaced by someone unpredictable and volatile. His wife, trapped in the storm of his suspicion, grew weary and frightened. She had never continued the arrangement, yet she was punished daily for something she had not done. Her attempts to reassure him were twisted into further accusations. The bruises left on her heart were invisible, but they weighed heavily on her. She began withdrawing into herself, avoiding conversations, hiding in silence, and living in constant fear of when the next explosion of anger would come. The two households mirrored each other in their destruction. The friendships that had once bound them together vanished, replaced by suspicion and hostility. The wives no longer met casually as they once had, each burdened with secrets too dangerous to share. The husbands, once neighbors who had shared beers and laughs, now saw one another as rivals, each convinced that the other had taken something from him. The trust that had allowed them to step into this dangerous fantasy was gone, and in its place lay betrayal and resentment. The wife who had fallen into the affair began taking more risks. She met her lover in motels, parking lots, and even inside his home when his wife was gone. She told herself she was careful, but her husband's watchful eyes caught every slip. He tracked her phone location and followed her on nights when she thought she was free. He sat in his car outside a motel once, watching her go inside with the man who had been his friend. The image burned into his mind, a wound so deep that it festered into obsession. He sat in the darkness, gripping the steering wheel, fantasizing about ending it all in one violent act. Meanwhile, the second husband, whose marriage had collapsed under the weight of suspicion, began carrying a weapon. He told himself it was for protection, but it was really a reflection of the paranoia that consumed him. He believed that the other man had not only betrayed him but also mocked him. He imagined conspiracies where everyone laughed at his expense, where his wife was a willing participant in humiliating him. The weapon became a symbol of his determination to never be a victim again, even if it meant taking matters into his own hands. The tension between the four of them grew unbearable. Neighbors began to notice strange behavior, cars parked outside homes at odd hours, muffled arguments that spilled into the street, sudden coldness between people who had once seemed inseparable. Rumors spread quietly, but no one truly understood the depth of what was happening. On the surface, it was just another suburban street. Behind closed doors, it was a battlefield. The affair did not slow down. In fact, the secrecy only added fuel to the fire. The wife told herself she was in love, but it was more complicated than that. It was not just about passion, it was about escaping the prison of her marriage. Her husband's anger and obsession had pushed her further into the arms of her lover, creating a cycle she could not break. The more he tried to control her, the more she pulled away, and the more she pulled away, the angrier he became. The stage was set for disaster. One man carried proof of betrayal and simmered with rage. The other carried a weapon and lived in paranoia. The wives were caught in the middle, one guilty of secrets, the other guilty only of being accused. The lives that had once been ordinary were now entwined in a web of deceit and obsession that had no easy escape. Every day that passed drew them closer to the breaking point. The lies piled higher, the anger grew stronger, and the silence between them became more dangerous than any words could have been. The fantasy that had been meant to breathe life into their marriages had transformed into something unrecognizable. It was no longer about excitement or adventure. It was about survival, revenge, and the inevitability of violence. The neighborhood slept each night in ignorance, unaware of the darkness festering behind those walls. But inside the homes, it was only a matter of time before suspicion turned into confrontation, and confrontation turned into bloodshed. The choices they had made could no longer be undone, and the end was already written in the tension that choked the air around them. The night it all came crashing down did not begin with violence. It began with silence, the kind of silence that clung to the walls of a house and made every sound unbearable. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the sky, but inside the home, the tension was far heavier than the storm outside. One husband had been watching and waiting for weeks, following every move his wife made, studying her like a detective who knew the truth but wanted to catch the guilty in the act. That night he could no longer wait. He had proof in his pocket, anger in his chest, and a weapon hidden just out of sight. He arrived home earlier than usual and found her gone again. The excuses had grown thinner by the day, and now he knew exactly where she had gone. His pulse hammered as he drove through the rain-soaked streets, headlights slicing through the darkness. He had followed her countless times before, but this night was different. This night he was not only an observer, he was ready to take action. The motel where they met was dimly lit, the neon sign buzzing and flickering in the rain. His car idled in the parking lot as he sat gripping the steering wheel, watching her walk into the room she thought was hidden. His friend's car sat just 2 doors down, confirmation that his worst fears had always been true. For several minutes he sat there, rain pounding on the roof of his car, his breath fogging the windows. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to leave, but the rage inside him chained him to that spot. He told himself that enough was enough, that this humiliation could not continue. He reached for the weapon he had brought with him, sliding it under his coat, and stepped out into the storm. What happened inside that room would forever change their lives. He burst through the door with the force of a man possessed, catching them off guard in their moment of stolen passion. The scene froze for a moment, the three of them locked in stunned silence as thunder shook the sky outside. Then chaos erupted. Shouts filled the room, objects crashed to the floor, and in the struggle, the weapon was drawn. He had come for confrontation, but his fury made restraint impossible. In the chaos, blood was spilled. His friend, the man he had once trusted, collapsed to the ground, his eyes wide with shock as he gasped for breath. The wife screamed, the sound piercing through the storm, but it was too late. The man's rage had already tipped into violence, and the reality of what he had done began to seep into the room like the rainwater pooling at the doorway. The silence after the act was suffocating. The storm outside seemed quieter compared to the pounding of his heart. His wife stood frozen, her face pale with horror as she stared at the lifeless body on the floor. He looked down at his hands, trembling, stained with the irreversible consequence of his rage. For weeks he had fantasized about revenge, about punishing the betrayal that had consumed him. But now, faced with the reality of death, his mind spiraled into panic. He stumbled back from the scene, muttering to himself, though no words could erase what had been done. His wife rushed to the fallen man, her sobs filling the room. She tried to shake him awake, tried to will him back to life, but there was no undoing the damage. The man who had been her secret passion, her escape from a cold marriage, was gone. And the husband she had betrayed stood above her, weapon still in hand. Staring at the destruction of everything they had once known, the noise and commotion did not go unnoticed. Neighbors at the motel, startled by the shouting and the sounds of a struggle, called the police. Within minutes, flashing lights lit up the rain-soaked lot, sirens cutting through the night. Panic spread through the wife as she realized what was coming. She pleaded with her husband to leave, to run, to escape before it was too late. But he stood frozen, rooted to the spot, unable to process what he had done. When officers entered the room, the scene told its own story. A body on the floor, a woman sobbing uncontrollably, and a man with a weapon, his face twisted with a mix of rage and despair. The arrest was swift, his resistance half-hearted, as if he already knew there was nowhere left to run. He was dragged out into the storm, handcuffed and drenched, his shouts drowned by the sound of sirens and thunder. Back inside, the wife sat in shock, unable to comprehend how quickly her world had collapsed. Only hours earlier she had been wrapped in the thrill of Forbidden's love. Now she sat in a blood-stained room, staring at the man she had risked everything for, lifeless at her feet. The betrayal that had seemed so intoxicating had ended in horror, and the fantasy she once craved had become her prison. Meanwhile, the other couple was pulled into the tragedy from the moment the police began piecing together the story. The second wife, who had endured endless accusations and violence without ever straying, was forced to face the reality of what their choices had unleashed. Her husband, who had carried a weapon out of paranoia, now looked at the crime as proof that betrayal had been inevitable, even if she herself had not been guilty. Their already broken marriage crumbled under the weight of the scandal. In the days that followed, the details emerged slowly, painted in headlines and whispered in gossip across the neighborhood. What had once been seen as an ordinary suburban block was now infamous for the scandal that ended in bloodshed. Reporters camped outside the homes, hungry for details of the shocking story. Neighbors who had once waved politely now stared with morbid fascination, trying to reconcile the people they thought they knew with the truth that had been exposed. The surviving wife was left torn apart by grief and guilt. She had lost her lover in the most violent way imaginable, and she had to face the reality that her choices had played a role in unleashing her husband's fury. Her attempts to justify her actions seemed hollow even to herself. The affair that had begun as an escape had ended with destruction that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The husband sat in a jail cell, his rage finally burned out, replaced by emptiness. He had wanted proof, he had wanted justice for the betrayal he felt, but what he had achieved was far worse. He had destroyed not only his marriage but also his freedom, his future, and the fragile fabric of the community around him. He replayed the moment in his mind endlessly, wondering when he had crossed the line from suspicion to violence. The answer was always the same: too late. The fantasy that had been meant to bring new life to stagnant marriages had unraveled into devastation. It had begun with whispered curiosity, fueled by secrecy, and ended in blood on the floor of a motel room. The promise of excitement had been replaced with grief, betrayal, and destruction that no one could undo. The storm that night eventually passed, but the darkness it revealed never left. The hours after the killing blurred together in a haze of flashing lights, police tape, and whispered questions that no one wanted to answer. Detectives moved methodically through the motel room, photographing the blood-stained carpet, collecting the weapon, and interviewing witnesses who had heard the commotion. What was once a private fantasy between four people had spilled out into the open, transformed into a public scandal. The quiet suburban neighborhood where the couples lived was thrust under the glare of news cameras, and their secrets could no longer hide behind drawn curtains and polite smiles. The surviving wife was escorted from the scene, her clothes damp from the storm and her face streaked with tears. Her mind replayed the moments leading up to the fatal confrontation, but every detail felt unreal. Hours earlier she had been lost in the thrill of passion. Now she was giving statements to police officers, trying to explain how her husband had discovered the affair and turned it into a blood-soaked nightmare. Her voice trembled as she recounted the events, but every word she spoke seemed to dig her deeper into guilt. She knew she had not pulled the trigger, yet she could not escape the feeling that she had set the chain of events in motion. Her husband sat in a holding cell, his hands still trembling from the violence he had unleashed. His fury had carried him through the act, but now only emptiness remained. He had wanted to expose his wife, to force her to face the betrayal, but instead he had destroyed everything around him. The rage that once seemed so powerful had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow man staring at the walls of a cell that would likely become his future. He muttered to himself that he had been pushed to the edge, that no man could endure what he had suffered. But even he could not convince himself that the murder had been justified. Investigators pieced together the story quickly. The affair was no secret once phones were examined, text messages pulled, and locations traced. There were countless digital footprints, late-night messages that turned into romantic declarations, secret plans for meetings, and even photographs exchanged that erased any chance of denial. The betrayal was laid out in stark detail, a timeline of passion that showed exactly how the fantasy had spun out of control. The detectives presented the evidence with precision, but even they were unsettled by how quickly an arrangement meant for excitement had devolved into obsession and violence. The trial that followed gripped the entire community. Reporters filled the courtroom, sketch artists captured the faces of the players, and every sordid detail of the story was dissected in headlines. The husband was charged with murder, his lawyers attempting to argue that he had acted in a fit of passion, a crime of impulse brought on by unbearable betrayal. They painted him as a man humiliated, provoked beyond reason, and pushed to the breaking point. But the prosecution had the weapon, the surveillance footage, and the mountain of messages showing weeks of planning and obsession. They argued that the act was not spontaneous but inevitable, the culmination of rage that had been building for months. The surviving wife was forced to testify, her pain laid bare for the public to devour. She spoke about the loneliness that had driven her into another man's arms, about the thrill that blinded her to the danger she was creating. She admitted her role in betraying her marriage, but nothing could soften the image of her sobbing on the motel floor beside her lover's lifeless body. Her words became fuel for both sides. To the defense, they were proof of how deeply she had wounded her husband. To the prosecution, they were evidence that the affair had no bearing on the deliberate act of murder. The second couple, who had once been drawn into the fantasy as willing participants, became reluctant witnesses to the destruction. The second wife testified with visible exhaustion, her voice heavy with the toll of months of suspicion and violence in her own home. She revealed how her husband's paranoia had spiraled after the arrangement, how he had carried a weapon for weeks out of fear and anger. Though he had not committed the murder, the cracks in his mind and marriage were exposed for everyone to see. Their private battles became public shame, and the collapse of their relationship was etched into the record of the trial. As the weeks of testimony unfolded, the jury heard a story that seemed too twisted to be real. Two couples in search of excitement, a wife who found more than she bargained for, and a husband who turned suspicion into obsession until he could no longer control his rage. The details captivated the public not only because of the violence but because it forced people to confront the darkness that can exist behind the facades of ordinary lives. The case became a cautionary tale whispered at dinner tables and debated in hushed tones at offices and schools. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom held its breath. The husband was found guilty of murder, sentenced to life behind bars. The judge spoke of choices, of betrayal, and of the irreversible consequences of anger turned into action. The gavel struck, and the man who had once lived a quiet suburban life was led away in chains, his future sealed by his inability to control the fury that consumed him. The aftermath left scars on everyone connected to the case. The surviving wife, once intoxicated by passion, found herself alone, haunted by the loss of her lover and the ruin of her marriage. She became a recluse, avoiding the stares and whispers of neighbors who saw her as the woman who had caused it all. The second couple dissolved completely, their marriage shattered by suspicion and paranoia that had outlasted the trial. The neighborhood that had once been a place of barbecues and block parties now carried a permanent stain, its residents forever reminded of the tragedy that had unfolded among them. Years later, the story was still remembered. Documentaries retold the events, each one painting the picture of how a simple fantasy spiraled into violence. True crime enthusiasts dissected the case, analyzing every decision, every text message, every mistake that led to the motel room drenched in blood. But for those who lived it, the story was no longer a headline. It was a nightmare that never ended, a reminder of how easily desire, jealousy, and obsession can destroy lives. In the end, what began as a search for excitement left nothing but devastation. The couples who once thought they could control their dangerous curiosity lost everything: love, trust, freedom, and even life itself. The wife-swap fantasy had turned into a cautionary tale of betrayal and murder, a story that echoed far beyond the quiet streets where it began. The choices they made could never be undone, and the memory of what happened remained etched into every whispered retelling of the tragedy.